This is the Economic Club of Florida, a distinguished platform for discussion of the major national issues of the day. On today's program, Dr. Penelope Prime of the China Research Center on how China has developed into an economic superpower since her first visit 40 years ago.
You also had a sense that people were hardworking and willing to learn, and so there's a certain energy there that has carried China through and is partly why they've been so successful, I think.
Good day and welcome to the 555th in our series of distinguished speaker programs. I'm Harvey Bennett for the Economic Club of Florida. We welcome today someone who has spent most of her entire life studying the country of China and its changing role in the world economy, and most recently, the U.S. economy. Dr. Penelope Prime is founding director of the China Research Center based out of Georgia Tech University in Atlanta. Dr. Prime, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Well, it was back in the 1970s, mid-70s, that you, as a 20-something undergraduate student, took your first trip to China. You were one of the first American research students allowed to do so after President Carter normalized relations. Take us back to that time. What did you find on your first visit to China?
Well, it was a country seemingly just waking up. You know, it's kind of cliche, but it was not integrated with the global economy in any serious way. And so we had to take the train from Hong Kong to Shenzhen and get off and then walk across the border with our luggage and get on another train to go into China. And that's just so far from how it is today. But we found people to be extremely gracious and curious about us, but also proud about their history and wanted to share that with us and share their culture with us. So all of those things are pretty similar with today.
Sure. Did it seem like a third world country?
It was certainly a relatively poor developing country.
Did you ever imagine after that first visit that China, now some 40 years later, could have one of the biggest economies in the world rivaling the United States?
Well, probably not, but you also had a sense that people were hardworking and willing to learn, and so there's a certain energy there that has carried China through and is partly why they've been so successful, I think.
And they have a large population.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what you are going to share with the club today.
So my topic is U.S.-China economic relations, and I am trained as a trade and development economist, and so that's what I do my research on. And so I'm going to put U.S.-China economic relations in that context and how it's changed over time by looking at it from China's point of view and from the U.S.'s point of view.
Can we get along, economy-wise?
In some ways, yes, and I certainly hope so.
We look forward to it. Dr. Penelope Prime, founding director of the China Research Center in Atlanta, thank you. We look forward to hearing your formal remarks on U.S.-China economic relations revisited.
Thank you so much.
Now, here's Barney Bishop III, chairman of the Economic Club of Florida, with our formal introduction.
Our distinguished speaker, Dr. Penelope Prime, has traveled to China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong over 200 times over the last 4 decades. After becoming one of the first American graduate students allowed into China in the 1970s. It was fully opened by President Jimmy Carter in 1979, 7 years after Richard Nixon and then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger shocked the world by seeking rapprochement between the two former enemies. Fluent in Mandarin as a result of her undergraduate studies at the University of Denver in 2001, she founded the China Research Center in Atlanta as a way to share her insightful knowledge of China's economy and its people. And it's the most populous country in the world with over 1.4 billion people. China spans 5 different time zones, borders 14 different countries, second only to Russia. The earliest mention of China is dated back to 1250 BC, and so the land of the Red Dragon has, in one form or another, been around for over 3 millennia, rivaling ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India. In the Echo newsletter on your table, you can see her impressive background, but I want to highlight a few important points and then let our speaker talk to us about China's economy and the geopolitics of our current relationship. Importantly, you should know that while the China Research Center has worked with the Confucius Institute, it has never received any government funding from China, nor from that matter from any government, including our own. The center is solely funded by corporate and private funding, so her comments today represent her professional and her personal view and not that of any government. Appropriately, Dr. Prime is a retired economics professor, having earned her master's degree and her doctorate from the University of Michigan. She has taught economics at both U.S. universities and at U.S.-based universities in China, and at the Ministry of Economics in Taiwan. She is a managing editor of China Currents, a research periodical on China, and she's a member of the National Committee for U.S.-China Relations. And she is co-author of 2 college textbooks, Global Giant, Is China Changing the Rules of the Game? And Taiwan's Democracy, Economic and Political Challenges. Given what is happening in the world today vis-a-vis Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Russia's burgeoning economic and political relationship with China, Dr. Prime's comments will be very relevant and timely. She continues on a daily basis to read Chinese newspapers and scholarly texts so that she can stay abreast of current events in the 3rd largest country in the world. Dramatic changes are occurring daily in China, and as we meet today, the Chinese stock market is crashing, with the Hong Kong China Index down 7.2%, down 28% in the last month, and a whopping 45% in the last year. This is a loss of over $1.1 trillion in value, due primarily to growing international concerns about China's ties to Russia, but also due to potential SEC delisting of some Chinese companies in the American stock markets, and ongoing regulatory concerns due to an overheated domestic housing market that is teetering on a potential total collapse. Moreover, China is once again locked down fighting a COVID outbreak impacting 51 million people that will continue to have dramatic impacts on global supply chains and thus the world's economy. Here to sort it out for us, Dr. Penelope Prime. Please give her a warm economic hug welcome.
Okay, well, after that, it's a hard act to follow. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to meet you. I'm pleased to be here. It is my first time to give a presentation in person since COVID, although we did many of them on Zoom and Skype and all over that time period. But it is fun. Look people in the eye and say, hi. So my task today is to talk about U.S.-China economic relations. And there is, of course, it influences political relations and military relations, and I can touch on that to some extent. But I am an economist. I'm trained in international trade and economic development, and that's how I viewed and learned about China over all these decades. So that's what I'm going to focus on primarily, and I will make a few remarks about Ukraine, but at the end. So what I'd like to do is really kind of set up what, how I've done my research and how I've thought about China's development over time, and I think that gives us a nice background to understand what's going on. Okay. This did work before. There we go. So just a little bit of my background in addition to Barney's nice, wonderful introduction that, I did start to study China at a time when the U.S. did not have relations with China. So I was fortunate enough to visit in 1976. It's a long story, so I won't go into it here. But spent a month in China after just graduating with my undergrad in Chinese studies. So it was a wonderful opportunity, very interesting time. But it was a really different place, of course, than it is now. And it was just emerging into the global system. They were very curious about us. We were curious about them. But they also were very hardworking and also proud of their history. But it's just starting to figure out where do we go from here. And so the picture on the top right is the skyline of Nanjing, the capital city of Jiangsu province. There was one tall building, and it was just recently built. It was the Jinling Hotel, and I forget which foreign investment it was from, which country, but that's what it looked like. And the city had literally 5 restaurants in the whole city for 4 million people. So it's just so totally different. But having said that, I also feel that the more I study China, the less I really know. And I think the reason I say that is because it's so complex. There's all these layers of understanding and complexity that I think it's sometimes we make things too simple, or we want a simple answer that just doesn't exist. So with that in mind, these are 3 things that I tell my students when we visit China together or when I'm teaching them about China to keep in mind, to help us understand what we're seeing, what we're experiencing, or what we're hearing. And the first one is that I find it very, very helpful to compare what's happened over time rather than always saying, well, we do this, but China does that. Or we have this GDP per capita, China has only that. Because that's not actually relevant. It's about where we've been and where we're going, and where China's been and where China's going. And so if you look at those early pictures and then look at what it looks like today, it's that process that we need to understand that's helpful. Whoops, sorry. So the second one is to understand that China is not a monolith. We say, oh, China thinks this. China doesn't think that. There's lots and lots of thought in China, and different opinions, and different interest groups, even at the highest level. So you'll have the Ministry of Petroleum disagree with the Ministry of Commerce, right? And they compete for the kinds of policies that they want. Sound familiar, right? So you can lobby in China too, just like we do here. And it's also, there's different ethnic groups, there's different parts of the country. It's a big place. And so even with Chinese food, seems hill and dale has their own cuisine. So it's a very, very diverse place. And I think that gets missed when we read the Wall Street Journal, for example, right? It's just that part it's all Beijing, it's all President Xi, it's like one decision and everybody follows. And that's not true. It is a single party system with the Chinese Communist Party, and it doesn't tolerate other parties. No question about that. But that doesn't mean there's a lot of different opinions and interests and forces shaping what happens in that country. The third thing is distinguish between the governments and people, because they're not the same. And there's also different levels of government. And so we may not like government policy, but that doesn't mean we can't like Chinese people, right? It's just that there's that whole society richness of culture and ideas and productivity and good things that can come out of working with people. So setting up the U.S.-China economic relations, I would be remiss not to remind us that the U.S. and China has had long-standing positive relationships and with mutual interests with both countries. So we have, I think, remember the good relationships and the good things that have come out of that relationship as we go into a period which is different, right? Which we have more concerns, and China has more concerns relative to us. But with the opening of China with our diplomatic relations in 1979, we accomplished basically the end of the Cold War with China's help, and then built an economic relationship that helped both countries, was very beneficial to both countries over many decades. And so the crux of my argument that I would like to present and share with you today is that the economic background of what we're looking at is the diminishing returns to trade. We've had lots and lots of trade with China, right? It's grown over time, and I'll show you some data in a minute. But that the additional benefits that we're going to get by trading even more with China are pretty small. And so, the phase one trade agreement that we had under President Trump with China was probably not the right way to go, because that was asking China to buy more of our stuff, and that'll make things right. But that's not really where the two economies are anymore. So I would argue it really is about a competition over innovation. So diminishing returns to trade, increasing returns to innovation. And that trade actually was easier to handle and to manage because we had data and we could see what the products were. But innovation is harder. It's we don't know where innovation is going to lead us or where the companies in China are going to take it. And for some of the key technologies, we are both right on the frontier. So that's where the competition is really intense. And some of those frontiers have military dual use as well, right? So I think that's kind of the economic crux of some of the competition that we're looking at. And then we have the political reality, which is that from China's point of view, they see the West in decline. They see China's rising and the West is declining. And so that opens up a whole different set of opportunities for them from their point of view. And that President Xi is the kind of leader who wants to be remembered in a very positive historical light in the Chinese context. And so that means he must deliver very important things. Right? Somehow he's got to accomplish a lot of things that will matter in history 100, 200, 300 years later. And so he has big ideas and big plans. So one of the pieces of that is that he has orchestrated the top leadership to allow him to have a third term. Under Deng Xiaoping, it was set up that the leaders would have 10-year terms. After the first 5 years, they would pick a successor and groom them, and there would be peaceful transition, which isn't easy to do in a one-party system. But Deng Xiaoping set this up, and it worked pretty well until President Xi wants to be above that. The other thing he's done is change the history, the party history of the Chinese Communist Party to make Xi Jinping thought to be at the same level as Mao Zedong thought. And so he's a new kind of leader, a leader of modern China on the level of Mao Zedong. At least that's where he's planting himself. So that context makes it even harder in some ways to maintain the kinds of relationships that we've had in the past. So I'm going to review this in 4 parts. Some of it kind of overlaps, but I'll first give you this larger macro political economy context. Okay. Oops, shit. It wants to do its own thing. Okay, so the big picture here is that both countries face economic challenges that aren't necessarily dissimilar, but they're not exactly the same either. But that the interconnection of our two economies is very, very deep. And that same interconnection helped both economies grow, and now it's causing some distrust and some worries on both sides and tension that's not helping the conversation. So each one tends to blame the other for our problems, right? I mean, if in any national political campaign, you would think China was running for office because it gets pointed to that with all these different problems, it's because of China. Well, China does the same thing. The U.S., they're doing this and this, which isn't helping us. And so, the domestic rhetoric around this relationship is pretty intense. Our companies, Chinese companies working here and our U.S. companies working there get caught in the middle. Right, so their political risk has risen, and so many of them are trying to decide what they're going to do to continue. Okay, from the Chinese perspective on growth, the story isn't very good, right? We had a great story with 10, 12% growth for many, many years, and so this was at the top of that growth, and it's been slowly falling since. The good news is this is what we call a soft landing, right? That it's decreased slowly over time and not just crashed. So they've avoided a recession, except during COVID. So this downward slant is not good news for President Xi, right? He can't have an economy that doesn't function well and still be the grand leader. So last year, 2021, the economy actually rebounded to just over 8%, but now this year the plan is 5.5%. But most analysts think it'll be hard for China to reach that 5.5% because of all COVID continues and lots of other issues in the economy. But nonetheless, it's not an upward trend. Now, from the U.S. point of view, we also have these challenges. We have the financial crisis, we have the trade war with China, we have COVID, now inflation, and of course the war in Ukraine. And so often we look at our growth challenges and say, well, it's because of trade with China, or it's because whatever is happening is not working out for us. So the trade issue, this is China's trade globally, not just to the U.S., but globally, starting in 1950. So you can see that in the first years under Mao, there was almost no trade at all. It was an autarkic economy. It did trade a little bit in order to get absolute essentials, but basically it wasn't a trading nation. Then with the opening under Deng Xiaoping, you can see there was an increase in trade. And a lot of that was driven by foreign investment in southern China. And then in 2001, China joined the WTO, and that's when exports really took off. And today, they're high, but not growing as fast as they were before. But again, China's growth is not going to be propelled in the future by more trade. It really needs structural change so that its growth is pushed by productivity and consumer demand and things like that. Now this is the U.S. exports, and it's just important to note that the U.S. is also a very important exporting nation. And we export nearly as much as China does. And so, get my trend line in there. And so we have had impressive success with exports too. The issue with China is we both export to the world, but we buy more from China than China buys from us, right? So the trade deficit with China has been a big issue, particularly in the political realm. And you can see the red bars are the US-China trade deficit, and the blue bars are the US total trade deficit. So we clearly have trade deficits with lots of people, lots of countries around the world, and not just China, but China's been a big piece of that. And that, until recently at least, has caused a lot of tension. And it was the basis of our trade war with China under President Trump. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention lately, and I think the reason is because we've moved on, right? What really matters is technology and innovation. Okay, so the view from China is, on the left-hand side, those pictures, are what it was like in 1976, and the two on the right are what it's like now. The top left one is the harbor in Shanghai in 1976. And you wouldn't even recognize it, as a major city at that time. But it was China's major city at that time. And so it's a rapidly changing society and economy, largely due to domestic changes in terms of freedoms, market reforms, investment, etc. So these companies and infrastructure are all domestic. And so it's, again, just a totally different economy. And the people in China are proud of that. They have worked hard. They have used smart policies, and they've reduced poverty and modernized and created wealth and have moved up in the world, you could say. I could talk a whole talk on what are the success factors, but I will just say that having savings available for investment and investing wisely and a lot made it a big difference. But that's also combined with the economic reforms that occurred over those decades. So without those reforms, this wouldn't have succeeded. And for that, we give a lot of credit to Deng Xiaoping's leadership that really pushed those reforms forward, even after Tiananmen, and invited Western investment and promoted exports and promoted production within the country and pushed the Chinese companies to move up the value chain. In a way, it's like a development textbook example of what you're supposed to do. And it's for other countries, it's been very hard to do often. Although Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, they've all been very successful at this. And China has followed behind them. Today, China's changing its approach to its future economic growth, where they want more sustainability and, of course, innovation, more resilience, so less dependence on the global economy. just like we would like a little less dependence on the global economy. And so not just focusing on growth anymore, but the quality of production and the quality of growth is becoming important, as well as environmental sustainability, and again, their independence. So one of the big policy ideas that are in China is this notion of indigenous innovation. So again, really focusing on how can China be an innovative economy and what does it take to do that. So some years ago, this Made in China 2025 was an official policy, and this really worried people in the US. Because all of a sudden it's like, oh, so the competition is now coming, again, from innovation, and so that China will be its own engine of growth at the frontier of some of these technologies. And so the policy statement 2025 listed 10 large categories of really sophisticated technology where they were going to focus. And it included things like robotics and artificial intelligence and semiconductors and green technology, these kinds of things, which from a development point of view is right where they're at. You know, that should be the next step. That makes a lot of sense from the economic point of view. But from the global point of view, people are worried that it might, you know, if it has dual use, it's going to bolster the military, and if we don't trust China, how are they going to, you know, they're going to get ahead of us, and what does that mean? And so there's a lot of back and forth about this. So again, the U.S. is wondering what this means and how do we fight back? And we're still working this out. There's not a final answer, I would say. Okay, so we can see that the U.S. official kind of approach to China started to change in the second term of the Obama administration. And this was in response largely to the cyber theft that was occurring, that industrial theft that was used to support the innovation push in China in part. And so Obama's pivot to Asia was an attempt to gather our allies and think about together how do we manage this relationship. Under the Trump administration, the focus was more on trade, but it also has security bent to it. Meanwhile, China's Navy is the largest in the world today. They have, over the years, invested in ships. They have many more ships than we do, and they're much newer than ours. And so this question of what's China's end goal? What is the purpose? What is happening? It gets asked more and more. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. started to scrutinize businesses more carefully, foreign investment coming into the U.S., but also U.S. businesses in China. And then, of course, COVID-19 occurred, and so that caused other kinds of concerns about the relationship. Now, with President Biden, not that much has changed. There are people in his administration who tend to downplay engagement today, but President Biden himself is more, well, let's engage, let's talk. So it's a little unclear what the overall policy will end up being with our current leadership. But U.S. worries about indigenous innovation are many, that China will use state-supported incentives, there's local protection, keep our companies out, that they won't move forward on economic liberalization, there's dual use, and espionage, all of these kinds of things. It kind of all goes together when you talk about innovation. And China's aware of this. So today, they don't mention China 2025 anymore. It's like they've moved on, and they don't use that terminology, in part to not provoke the U.S. and other Western allies. It's not just the U.S. Okay, and with economics and business, of course, we have the realities of this interdependence became very, very clear with COVID, and that there were critical health products that were only produced in China, and we needed them, and so we scrambled there for quite a while, and it raised again the knowledge or information about how integrated we are and how that can matter. Nonetheless, China's markets are huge, and if you're a publicly traded company and not doing business in China, you're probably going to be in trouble in terms of investors. So there's a tremendous pressure to be in those markets, especially with the consumer goods markets. That's where the growth is going to be in the future. And so it's very difficult to imagine us not participating in that market, and that the scale of those markets do matter. So going forward, and I will say I don't have any silver bullet or anything, but it is helpful, I think, to think about, so what does China want anyway? And so this was my list, that number one, they want to ensure that the Chinese Communist Party stays in power. That's the most important bottom line. They want to maintain stability in their country. They want to avoid a middle income trap, which is the idea that China's economy will continue to fall and growth rates will fall, and that it won't actually be able to become a high income country. From the development textbooks, China's doing absolutely everything they can to avoid that. But nonetheless, they do have some major structural issues in their economy which is causing growth to slow. And having more economic stimulus is not going to help that. It's only going to make debt higher and have other problems. So it is a real concern. Whoops, sorry. This is a little trickier than I thought. Okay. They do want to complete the one China policy with Taiwan one way or another. We need to have smart policy to encourage that to be in a peaceful way. They want to gain international respect, and they want to increase their role in the world, especially in Asia. I think that's very reasonable. This is a country that has gone from being very, very poor to being quite wealthy and powerful, and they want to start to play a bigger role. Under earlier leaders, they were more, it's not time yet, right? We need to just learn from everyone else and just try to develop. But President Xi's attitude is different. China's made it, at least to a certain stage, and now China needs to be part of the global system in a new way. So there's all kinds of books out there. This is just one. And has China won? These kinds of great titles, but they're not necessarily great books. But so, will there be a winner? Will there be a loser? And I would argue such a trade-off is not inevitable. It's possible, but it's not inevitable. And, we need to think about the fact that we do not want to have war with China, and China does not want to have war with us. And so in that context, think about ways to have more win-win. And maybe it means, to some extent, pulling back for a while and see where President Xi goes with his policies and not making too many assumptions.
I think it's also dangerous to just assume that everything China does is nefarious and that we have to counter them, because then in the end they will, right? They will end up being more assertive, and that's not what we want. So one of the things that does disturb me is that, especially under President Trump, the connections between the US and China at all kinds of levels have been decimated. You know, there used to be working groups in different parts of the government, even Social Security, for example, that would communicate back and forth and learn from each other. We had student exchanges, we had faculty exchanges, we had, of course, you know, many kinds of conferences and things, and that has gotten, I mean, it's, of course, with COVID, it's now doesn't exist, but even before COVID, each one of them was closed down one by one. And so our understanding, our ways to understand China have disappeared. And I think that's dangerous. So how we go forward, I think China really does need to think about how can they be a more responsible global citizen. They don't like to talk about it that way, but that's okay. But to work on, you know, what is the transparency of their intentions? You know, what are their long-term goals? And a willingness to work within the framework for IPR protection, end cyber theft, and open their domestic markets. And things like with their One Belt, One Road investment project, to normalize that process with transparency, right? They've done some of that domestically, so they could do that with their investments abroad as well, and to continue their reforms at home. With the US, clearly we will, if we engage, it'll be selectively. So in other words, if there's very sensitive technology, then that technology is going to be protected. And companies are going to have to reevaluate what they do with China in that respect. But I think the US also could do more transparency on intentions and what are our long-term goals. Because we have had very high-level government officials call for regime change in China. That's extremely dangerous. It's not necessary, right? You can't, so how is President Xi and the Communist Party going to view that? Because we've been known to do regime change in other places. It's not, you know, it's not just words. So again, what are our intentions long term? And we, as a superpower for a very long time, have to accept the fact that other economies are going to grow and do well. And so I call it the rise of the rest. And so we need to accommodate the rise of other countries. And you know, we won't be as big relative to other countries as we have been in the past, but we'll still be very important. There's no reason for that not to happen. And then also to work on our own challenges at home. If we're strong at home, then we can manage with our allies and our competitors much better. Okay, so Ukraine, I have 1 minute. That's got me out of this. So Ukraine, of course, complicates things a little bit more. Last week was a little tense, not knowing what China's leadership was going to do in terms of supporting Russia or not. It looks like China will try to play both sides as usual, but not help Russia militarily. I don't believe they wanted Putin to invade Ukraine. It's not in China's interest at all. But they also don't like the expansion of NATO, and they really don't like sanctions. Right, so it was just a couple of years ago where Huawei and ZTE were sanctioned, and then other companies were sanctioned by the US. These are Chinese companies, and they really are unhappy about that. So with our sanctions on Russia, it's like, yeah, we don't like that. Don't do that. But still, I don't think that China's going to throw its lot in with Putin under the current circumstances. So that's good news. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm sure that the members have questions of Dr. Prime. We had a microphone in the middle of the room. Please bring it back. Here it is. Any members of the Economic Club would like to ask Dr. Prime a question? Please come forward. Oh, of course.
Hey, Dr. Prime, thank you so much for a very insightful commentary about today. So you mentioned the need for mutual respect, but I know this is going to sound China-phobic, but how can an American democracy which doesn't want to control other countries deal with a country like China that wants to use subterfuge, spying, all of the nefarious things that dictatorships want to do, and their goal is to dominate the world, or do I have it wrong?
Well, that's a big assumption. I guess I wouldn't start with the assumption that China wants to dominate the world. I don't think it's helpful. And, all countries spy. So it's a part of being realistic, I think. And also trying to find those areas where it's beneficial to more than China to work with them. So I think I might have missed the first part of your question, but
no, it was just that America, we want to see everybody rise, but that China really doesn't want to. The perception is that China wants to see everybody rise. They want to control them while they're helping.
Oh, okay. So one of the things is that really where the story is domestically within China. And we need to see how that plays out. And we've influenced it in great ways by, being part of their economic development process and by having people visit here and we visit there and having that interaction. But how China's politics actually moves forward will depend on China. And there's lots of people in China who do not agree with President Xi's positions and are unhappy with who lost the U.S., right? Because that relationship has been really important in all kinds of aspects of Chinese society. So, to some extent, we just have to wait and see how it plays out, but not, I think, just not act like, well, everything China does is bad for us.
All right, next question.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Prime. I found your presentation very, very informative. I have two questions. The first one is, why is President Xi pursuing a third term? And the second reason is there a reason, or why has there been an increase in political restrictions within China under President Xi? Thank you.
You mean like political, like in Xinjiang or what?
Well, political, there's less political freedom.
Oh, less political freedom.
Is there a reason behind that? Because in America, sometimes there may be an underlying reason, such as economic reforms, but we don't necessarily know. So, are there reasons for both?
Well, remember, I'm not a political scientist. I'm an economist. I do live with one, but so I haven't studied elite politics and President Xi like some people have. But people do argue, analysts do argue, that President Xi is the kind of person who does want ultimate power within China. So he's behaving much differently than other leaders in China have, except for Mao. So he's behaving a little bit like Mao did once they won the Civil War and he established the People's Republic of China. And then there was a cult of Mao. So now there's a cult of President Xi. And so, and it's not, I wouldn't argue that one person alone can make all of these changes work. But he has, through the anti-corruption campaign and through other political maneuvering, gotten his supporters in the key positions. So he has a lot of support at that very, very highest level. And you can think about the counter of that, or the support of that, is some loss of political freedom for other people, right? So you can't criticize Xi, but that hasn't ever been very popular in China anyway, to criticize the top leaders. Although debate about policy has been more open in the past than it is now, and that's unfortunate, and it doesn't help President Xi either.
Next question.
Yeah, so for about 10 years, I used to take undergraduate students to China, and like you, I found it to be fascinating. You'd go every summer and you'd see high-speed rail, more mobile phones, more people, urbanization, cars. I went to a car show in China, which, by the way, if you ever get to do that, it's a lot of fun. But the biggest change I saw over the course of 10 years was the restriction of the internet and the restriction of the freedom of information and sharing of information. And I think all of us would agree in this room that in Western liberal democracy, the free exchange of ideas, the marketplace of ideas is important and a contributor to innovation. How does she manage this? You watch him on TV, he talks about Chinese way and Harvard, but if you have a rising middle class that they leave China and go other places, are they going to rise up? Is this a rubber band that keeps stretching and breaks, or are they, for lack of a better term, conditioned and will go wrong? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, that's $1 million question, isn't it? And we don't know. It's definitely the case that there are a lot of people in China who do not like the increased restrictions, but there's also a lot of ways around them. So, people in China also like stability. They don't want chaos. So they don't want another cultural revolution or something like that. But nonetheless, there's demonstrations across China all the time when people get fed up. And I think, I learned from my political scientist friends that one of the hardest things to do in an autocracy is to keep the power, right? Because there's no way for society to say, hey, we don't like this, right? And unless the whole society does it and it all comes tumbling down. So and President Xi is pretty isolated with his supporters. So you just don't know. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but people in China could get fed up with the direction that China's going, and it is different than it was before. Having said that, though, they're also doing very well. The middle class is quite comfortable, and they don't want to give that up. But the pressures on housing, the cost of housing, and the environmental pressures, those are things that the government is really focusing on, because that's what the people want, is affordable housing and clean air and clean water. So the government also is quite responsive to people and to their interests. Unlike a government like in Cuba, which just doesn't make any sense to me at all, how they think they can continue to rule and starve their civilians. China's not like that. When they see a problem, they tackle it. And so they've done very well for their people. And that's a trade-off most people in China are willing to take for now.
Interesting. So one more question. Mr. Watkins.
Would you comment on the recognition of the rule of law in Chinese culture, and also, in your judgment, is Chinese Communist Party trustworthy?
No, actually, I don't think I'll comment on that. Well, the Chinese Communist Party is trustworthy in the way I just mentioned, that they are responsive to the people. They do want to be in power, however, and so if you have any idea about starting another party, you're going to be in jail before you think twice. But people understand that. In terms of rule of law, it has gotten more sophisticated in China, more developed. They have law schools, but the legal system is culturally different than ours, and it really matters. So you are guilty until proven innocent. And it's just the opposite. It still can work, but it's just so different. It's hard for us to say, oh, there's any rule of law at all. But that's not true. There is. And it's gotten better in terms of separating the judicial system from the party. It's not perfect. And if you're one of the legacy party people, like President Xi is called the princelings, so you're the son or daughter of one of the revolutionaries that fought with Mao, you can fix things. If you're not one of them, you often can't fix things, right? So, you know, it's a very different system. I'll end there.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Dr. Penelope Prime, founding director of the China Research Center, speaking before the Economic Club of Florida on March 22, 2022 in Tallahassee, Florida. For more information on the China Research Center, visit chinacenter.net. The Economic Club of Florida promotes interest and enlightenment on important economic, political, and social issues of the day. To learn more, including how to become a member, visit our website at economic-club.com. This program was recorded at the Florida State University Alumni Center in Tallahassee, Florida.